The Jays are going to have a big decision to make this offseason, and it doesn't have to be made in the offseason exactly, but they do have some things, some moving parts to decide here. The second base position is going to be wide open, and it's going to be there for the taking. So we're going to break down a couple of fits and much more on this episode of Jays Digest. What's up, Jays fans? I'm your host, Peter Vryonis, alongside host Nick Gosse. We saw the breakout of Davis Schneider last year. We saw his unbelievable 30-game stretch where he was just tearing the cover off the ball, and he was looking like the best hitter on the planet. And then we saw him kind of fall off a cliff and then kind of fall out of playing time as well after his cold streak. He was still hitting the ball hard, but he was striking out at a pretty ridiculous clip, and he just didn't look like the same hitter that made his spectacular debut with the Toronto Blue Jays. On the other hand, we saw Cavan Biggio really step into an everyday role, and he was hitting in the middle of the Toronto Blue Jays order and doing a great job at that. And then when it comes to Santiago Espinal, I mean, this guy was one of the best hitters down the stretch for the Toronto Blue Jays, hitting nearly 450 and getting on base at a ridiculous clip. Maybe the power's not exactly there, but these are three legitimate options that the Blue Jays can look at and explore for next season. But I don't think anything is set in stone, Nick. It's going to be really interesting to follow all these internal battles and positional battles throughout spring training.
Yeah, and we're going to be focusing on a couple of guys today, specifically David Schneider, because like you said, he was a guy who emerged. Before we do, around 70% of you guys aren't subscribed. We're on the road to 10,000. It would mean the world if you hit that button. Now, Peter, let's get right into the first guy we're going to talk about here, which is Davis Schneider. Now, we all know about Davis Schneider. We know about everything he's done, especially at the major league level. He had a 1.8 WAR in not that many games, 116 at-bats. He had 8 home runs. We remember the crazy time of the year, late August, when Davis Schneider was the best player I've ever seen. 175 OPS plus. He was unbelievable. Now, Peter, Davis Schneider is a guy that wasn't really, this time last year, when we were looking at all the prospects coming up and making similar videos, we weren't talking about Davis Schneider. He had a crazy rise, and ultimately he didn't play much down the stretch because of his 0 for 40 or 0 for 35 streak. But do you think that he's a guy that maybe will replace Santiago Espinal, which is another guy we'll talk about in a little bit? And do you want to see him as our everyday second baseman like some people on Twitter are suggesting?
Yeah, I do. I do want to see it. And I think what he was doing obviously isn't sustainable. I mean, you're not going to hit 400 and have a 250 OPS plus. This isn't the 1920s anymore, and he's not Babe Ruth. I know we had a video where we said he was better than Babe Ruth, but that was obviously
A
that
joke.
was a joke. Check that out if you want to. You'd have to scroll a little ways to find it. But he had an amazing stretch, and I think this is something that he can keep up. Maybe not the 175 OPS plus, but I think he can be around a 115 to maybe 125 type of guy just because of his approach that he possesses at the plate. The strikeouts were there, and that was well documented that he was going to have some swing and miss in his game. He had some in AAA. It's not magically going to disappear when he starts to face better pitching in the major leagues. Obviously, he's going to have his fair share of strikeouts, but whenever he did make contact, he was hitting that ball pretty damn hard, and he was getting on base as well. You pull up his stats, you see the 276 batting average. It's pretty impressive for a rookie that's coming up. But what's really impressive to me is the 404 on base percentage. It's a small sample size, 116 at bats, but he got on base. He drew his fair share of walks. And whenever he did make contact, that 603 slugging percentage is a pretty good indication that he was doing damage whenever he did make contact with the baseball. So he hit a lot of doubles, he hit a lot of home runs as well, and he drove in some big time runs. He won the Blue Jays a couple of games in that hot stretch that he had. And even in that 0 for 35 that you were talking about earlier on in the video, Nick, he was lacing the ball. He was just lining out, getting super unlucky. And then, of course, he lost his playing time because the coaching staff has no patience and they don't want to see players make that jump, and become everyday guys. He went 0 for 35. He was still lacing the ball to all fields, and he didn't see the field after that. He didn't see an at bat in the wild card games, and it was just unfortunate that it had to go down that way for Davis Schneider because he was truly one of the best stories in all of Major League Baseball, and I could really see him sustaining that kind of plate discipline and that kind of hard hit rate throughout next season. Will he be an everyday guy? I don't know. Will he be a platoon guy? Most likely, but his versatility makes him a pretty good option for the Toronto Blue Jays, and I want to see him play more than Espinal just because of the power potential that he possesses.
Yeah, and looking at David Schneider, the way that he kind of projects next season, as some people have noted here on Twitter, so a guy tweeted this: David Schneider is so hard to project because he does a lot of things very well, but I don't know how much of it is nullified by his awful zone contact rate. And there was also some responses to this, kind of praising David Schneider and the fact that he adjusted pretty well. Obviously, he went 0 for 35 or whatever it was. It's kind of a weird case because he swings and misses a lot. He doesn't make a lot of contact on pitches in the zone, but when he does make contact, it's at a crazy rate. He hits the ball really, really hard. Sometimes he'll get unlucky, and like he had in his 0 for 35, and he'll hit it right at a glove. But other times he'll hit home runs, which also gave him 8 home runs on 116 at-bats. And there's a lot more hits, hard hits, maybe even home runs that he could have hit if he would have got a bit more lucky in various parts of the ballpark. And probably not home runs, but especially extra base hits down that stretch. But ultimately, with David Schneider, I think he might be a better option than Santiago Espinal, and that's a guy we can discuss right here. He obviously was also one of our best hitters down the stretch. He kind of started to, thrive and blossom when David Schneider was getting ice cold, so it kind of worked out well in that regard. But the battle is really between Espinal and David Schneider here. Obviously, we have Kevin Biggio as well, but I think with Kevin Biggio, I think he has his role pretty sustained. He's a left-handed hitter. He does a lot of things right. He has a lot of more versatility. He can play the outfield like the other two can't. So between Santiago Espinal and David Schneider, that's the question, that the big decision the Jays have to make if they're not going to go out and get an external guy. And I think I'd rather have David Schneider because we've kind of seen what Espinal can do. Yeah, his ceiling is, an all-star with, great defense and, no power, really. Where David Schneider's, ceiling is a huge power-hitting second baseman, which are very, very hard to come by and can also take his walk and get average and do everything. So I think I'd rather take David Schneider in this case.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about ceiling, I want to shift it over to the floor, and I think David Schneider has the highest floor of any of those three, just because of that power that we keep talking about. We've seen Biggio go ice cold, and he's virtually unplayable at that stage when he does go ice cold. Same thing with Espinal. There was a point in the season where his OPS was below 600, and Kevin Biggio as well. I mean, they just weren't cutting it. And then David Schneider comes up, gives them some relief, and then Kevin Biggio and Espinal get that kick in the butt and that wake-up call, and then they start to perform a lot better. Yeah, I think Espinal, I think he's a pretty good player. He got a lot of hate this year, and I don't think it was necessarily warranted either. He was forced into some playing time that maybe he shouldn't have been forced into, but the Jays, they just didn't perform as a whole. You can't really pin it on Espinal, who was a part-time player. So I could see a world where all three of these guys make the team, but I do think that you should trade one of them, and I think that is going to be Espinal, to maybe a rebuilding team where he can get everyday playing time and maybe make a run at another all-star appearance. But I just don't think he has a place on this team just because of all the other options that we've been unpacking here over these past couple of videos. And it's going to be interesting. It's really going to be interesting to follow because I like all three. I like all three
Yeah.
of them. I think they're all pretty good players, and I think Biggio is going to be an everyday guy for this Toronto Blue Jays team. But I don't want to see him hitting fifth in the lineup either. That's got to change. They got to go out and get some more power on the free agent market. We've discussed options like Jorge Soler, Cody Bellinger. Those guys need to move Kevin Biggio down in the order because he's a pretty good player, but he's not a guy that you want hitting in the middle of a lineup, especially not when you're trying to contend for a World Series. So yeah, I think he's got his place kind of set here. David Schneider has an avenue where he could become an everyday player, but they need to make some additions and not have them be featured players, more as role players going forward.
Yeah, and if this is all, we're also kind of assuming to a degree that Matt Chapman is going to go. Not that this necessarily impacts it fully, but if he does go, there would be naturally a bit more playing time for David Schneider. And also, if we're having David Schneider, start in the infield with Santiago Espinal, I would want a guy like Jorge Soler or Cody Bellinger with a lot of power in the outfield to compensate for maybe a guy like Kevin Biggio getting more playing time. But we're also not taking into account that Arelis Martinez is a guy who's also probably, or Edison Berger, whoever you're higher on, probably going to start at some point for the Blue Jays at that third base spot. And you don't know what you're going to get out of them. So I think a lot of this has to do with the, subsequent offseason moves that need to happen because you want to get power. You want to get more guaranteed power in the outfield. And that gives you more of an ability to rely on David Schneider to go and do what he does best, which is just hit moonshots and strike out at a pretty ridiculous clip, which is pretty funny for a second baseman. But as you can see in the top there, he can also play third base. So maybe they decide to go with some crazy avenue. I hope this isn't the case, but maybe they start Biggio at second and David Schneider at third. I'd rather them maybe call up one of the rookies, but I don't know. At this point, he can also play left field according to Baseball Reference. He didn't play that for the Blue Jays, but I'm sure he has in the minor leagues. But that'll wrap up the video. Any quick final thoughts on the decision? Let us know in the comments what your decision would be out of those three. I think a lot of you guys would probably agree with us regarding Espinal. I think he has maybe made his way out, and maybe you should have traded him last year when his value was probably a little bit higher. But any quick thoughts before I wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, it's been proven time and time again that the Jays cannot run it back with this current group of players that they have. You can't rely on a 21-year-old or Elvis Martinez to come up and save your franchise. It's just not going to happen. You got to make additions on the free agent market, on the trade market, and you have the assets to go ahead and do that if you're the Toronto Blue Jays. So it's going to be an interesting offseason. They got to make some additions. They can't have these guys be focused players and I guess featured players in a sense. So yeah, it's going to be very cool to follow, and I'm curious to see what Ross Atkins does, because the free agent market, they haven't been too aggressive over the past couple of years. Obviously, they've had their big additions that they've made, but I'd like to see more of that this offseason.
I think this is the time that they maybe go out and do it, and it's going to hopefully come sooner than we know it as December approaches, and that's when stuff really starts to get going, as well as November. But thank you guys for watching. If you want to check out our video from yesterday, click the video on your screen now, and we'll see you guys in tomorrow's video.